Welcome to Building the Future. I'm your host, Kevin Horick. You can find the show online at buildingthefutureshow.com or follow me on Twitter at buildingshow. You can also find it on iTunes, Stitcher, and YouTube. I'm excited to announce that I am now a brand ambassador for the Business Rock Summit in Manchester, England, April 21st and 22nd, where Steve Wozniak is headlining. More details at business-rocks.com. Welcome back to the show. Today we have Gregg Oldring, founder of MailOut and co-founder of Inked It. Gregg, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Kevin. It's great to be here.
Yeah, thanks for doing this. I guess in full disclosure, maybe we should talk that we used to work together and that you were my boss, and we worked together for a number of years on a couple. Actually, I worked on both products, so
yes,
it's pretty cool, and I'm excited to have you on the show because you have lots of good advice and stories from the past, and I'm excited to have you on the show. So maybe before we kind of talk about MailOut and Inked It, let's talk about kind of where you grew up and how you got into technology.
Sure. Well, I grew up in Edmonton, Alberta, Canada. So unless someone's a hockey fan, they might not have heard of Edmonton. But it's pretty far north and west in Canada. So it's not generally speaking a hotbed of technology, but we've actually got a pretty cool startup scene here these days. And how I ended up getting into technology was kind of funny, actually. Like I had started into business. It was a really down economy when I was in university, and then in the 90s. So oil is what dominates the economy here in Alberta. And oil prices were really low. There was no jobs to be had. So I helped a friend start a business. And from that business, I had another friend who had started the first internet service provider in Alberta.
Interesting.
And yeah, he wanted me to come and he was like nagging me all the time to come and see the internet. Well, back then it was the information superhighway, right?
yeah, I remember that.
So, which was touted as free long distance. That was what how they'd describe on the news, on television, like what this internet thing is. Or this information superhighway. It's like free long distance because nobody had like a mental model of what this thing would be.
Sure.
So I was appropriately skeptical, especially because my friend, he's a good guy. He's a great guy, but I was like, you're full of crap. This is definitely dumb. But it would apply to this other business that I'd helped start. And if it, free long distance anyways. So anyways, I go to my buddy's office. This is October. Wow, it was October 94. So like 21 years ago.
Wow. Which
seems really weird to say. And he shows me a web page, and it was a web page from Switzerland on his 14-inch CRT monitor, and it blew my mind. Like this, I saw this expecting free long distance. I got this web page thing, and it just set my mind spinning. I was like, this is going to change everything. And so from there, I ended up creating another business kind of related to this first one that I'd helped start, which was a parts locator service for heavy truck parts. And then this other business was for classified advertising for construction equipment. And when we started it, getting back to the question how I got into technology, it came when we set up a web server, because of course we had to like set up a web server in our own basement sort of thing.
Sure.
Because that's just how things were done back then. With the web server came a book on how to set things up and how it all worked and so on. And it had one chapter on HTML. And I read that chapter and said, oh, I could do this. Didn't understand anything else too much, but I could figure that out. And view sourced from there. Looked at how people were making these web pages and just kept learning and learning.
I think that's how a lot of people learned in the early days. I remember doing the same thing. It's just like, I was like, oh, it's really cool how this guy's doing whatever, right? Like the blink tag or the marquee or something. And you're like, I want to do that. And then you just like view source and took it and put it on your site, right?
How did they make those blinking lights go on the sideline? Found that blink tag. It was funny too, because I got to tell that story of reading that book. Of course, the server software we had was O'Reilly and Associates website, And
Really?
so I got to tell Tim O'Reilly that story of like, yeah, you know what, you were the book that your company did was like how I got into this. And and he's like, oh wow, you know what? Mark Cuban told me the same thing. Just tells me this great story of like Mark Cuban. Like, yeah, I'm like exactly the same guy. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. You're like, we're pretty close.
Yeah, we're right. So that was really cool.
That's awesome. Was that when we were in Vegas? Was that the first time
It
you met
was.
him?
Yeah, it was at like a speaker dinner for in Vegas
Right, right.
at this the Future Web Apps show, which is that was a great conference
That
actually. It was
was
pretty
actually
cool.
we learned a lot and we had a really fun time actually. Yeah, it was fun.
Um, you know, because everything was kind of new and exciting and stuff. Like when you do a startup, it's always so fun.
Totally.
But I learned a lot too, and I was yeah, I was saying like one of the sad things of what I learned is learning things the hard way. I did like the worst demos at that conference because I'd never really done software demos, oddly.
Really?
So yeah, you know, I'd never really done demos. I would have done a couple, but I mean, I've tended to avoid them for the most part because it's, you know, a software demo is usually, I mean, it's what it is. Like watching someone use Microsoft Word. It's boring.
Sure.
There's no way to really make a software demo that exciting unless you've got like weird fanboys, right? Um, so that, yeah, I hadn't done a lot of that in the past. I'd always done selling where when I was demonstrating my product, I would actually be walking other people through it over the phone typically. So they'd be driving, and that's kind of how I would like to do selling typically. And the selling was more one-on-one, but I hadn't done certainly stuff up on stage where, you know, the whole like presenting to a large group at one time, my software. Just hadn't done that before. So I really
Sure.
sucked at it, but that's all right.
No, I
Live
don't
and
think it
learn.
was as bad as you thought it was. Like I thought people got something out of it, and like I remember sitting in the audience and watching that. But it is
Awesome.
interesting.
I'm just hard on myself.
No,
Sure.
yeah, well, totally. I think everybody is, right?
Yeah.
But it is interesting that you mentioned about not really doing demos, and you're kind of right. Like the more I think about it too, it is awkward kind of just showing somebody. It's a lot easier to kind of walk them through it and kind of watch them use the software instead of, you just kind of, because they don't remember, right? Whatever you
Yeah.
just fly, because you fly through, the software, you know where to go, you know where you're going. And it's interesting to watch them. And I think that's what's so fascinating almost about user testing.
Yeah. Oh, user testing is great for that. Is watching people sort of fumble along, and yeah, I mean, it's very humbling. Is what I mean, a demo, you polish it up, right, and everything works all smoothly, and there's no surprises to stuff. When you do some user testing, and you can watch the video of somebody using your stuff the way that they actually use it instead of the way you think that they use it. It just guts you sometimes. Like, oh, how did they not notice that that's the place to start, right? And they flounder around, but yeah, I mean, that's pretty powerful. But the other thing about it, I find, with getting people to drive, like whoever you're speaking to, if they're using the software instead of me showing them, there's a different dynamic there. And I think it's something about, I don't know, like in education, people who are educators, I could tell you more about it, but that you learn more, you retain more when you're making the decisions. Like you have to be paying attention to, finding the button to start like creating content, let's say, or it's just cognitively you're present in it in a very different way than if you're just watching a screen, because you're actively participating instead of just passively watching. And people get a lot more out of that than just watching a video.
Yeah, no, I think that makes a lot of sense. So maybe let's get to know you a little bit more and talk about
Sure.
kind of what did you take in school then?
I took 2 years of science,
Okay.
a year of art, and then I started a business degree. I started into the faculty of business here at the University of Alberta. And so I got credit for a couple of years. And so my first year of business was technically my third year of the degree.
Right.
And then in between, like that summer was when I helped my friend start that other business. And the reason why I did that is because I had nothing on my resume that would have helped me get a job, as far as I could tell. Nothing to do with business. Anyways, I worked at like summer camps and had knee surgeries that had me laid out for months at a time, things like that. So I wanted to do something that would be, I would think would help me get a job. And the prospects were pretty grim back then to get something to do with marketing, let's say, or even sales. I could dig a ditch. So I helped my friend start something.
Sure. So was that the company that eventually sold to Trader, or was that a?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Well, so no, not the one that I helped him start. So the one that I helped him start is called Parts Link.
Okay.
And it's like say the parts locator service for heavy truck parts.
Right.
And I did like 3,000 cold calls that summer.
Really?
And back then it was a fax-based thing, and so sort of classified advertising between these like heavy truck salvage yards.
Right.
And so the customers were great. Like, they were classic, really, really funny group of people, and just like characters. And half of them were thieves as well. Right? So
because this was still mid-90s, right? Like 95-ish?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, this is summer 94.
Okay.
And I was a great introduction into business, though, because the first thing I learned is make sure you get paid.
Fair.
So it was a really, really important lesson that has stuck with me since. Is like, make sure you get paid.
Sure.
Because those guys, if we didn't do that, we wouldn't have been paid, and that's how it would have been.
Right.
So yeah.
So then, how did you end up starting the second business that you were the parts rental, right?
So the second one was classified advertising for construction equipment. So the first one was parts, and then we were actually using faxes to send stuff out, to like send a list of what people were looking to buy and sell each night. We'd send this big long faxes, and as we were getting more customers, the faxes were getting longer. And so that's when I started my inquiries into the information superhighway, right?
Sure.
Because I wanted to save on long distance, because the long distance was killing us. So I'd done some math basically and realized, we're gonna hit a point pretty soon where if we keep adding more customers, it's gonna start costing us money, because the faxes were getting so long.
Right.
So when this is fall of '94, and so it was pretty apparent that the salvage yards weren't going to have internet access anytime soon. But related to that, like sort of, and then nearby business was the sale of complete trucks and also construction equipment. There was a bit of overlap, and construction equipment particularly. We knew that people bought and sold these things over long distances already. Like, this was an existing thing.
Right.
And this information superhighway was perfect for that, because, these items were expensive and scarce. So, they got sold over long distances. This is a great forum for matching those up. And so that's when I created that business. Actually, created it with my friend Scott, and we ended up dividing the two companies between us in '95.
Right.
And so then I ran that out of my parents' basement for the next couple of years until I ended up selling it to the guys that did the Auto Trader magazines for most of the world, except most of the states, actually. There's just one part of the states they own that brand. But they did classified advertising in like 17 or 18 countries when they bought GSNet.
Right. That's GSNet was your business. Yeah. Right. Okay.
Yeah.
So I'm curious.
Awesome name.
Yeah. Well, really whatever. Everybody had that, right? And you
worked.
were probably the top listing in Yahoo or Alta Vista or one of the other big search engines at the time.
That's another. I mean, that was another story of that was Yahoo. I mean, this is so early on that when I got that listed on Yahoo, there were 800 listings under business, right? And I got to meet Jerry Yang one time, and I was too starstruck at that moment to say, hey, you know what? You might even remember my business. But I was kind of, didn't see it coming. I just happened to meet him. So I was like,
sure,
get the chance to say that.
Sure. So you sold basically GSNet in the kind of 90s internet bubble. Is that correct?
Yeah, sort of the beginning of the bubble. So if I'd sold it a year later, I sold it in December '98,
Right.
and it was like an 8-month negotiation. Actually, it was a really long negotiation just for such a small business. Um, but yeah, if I'd sold it a year later, I could have made 10 times as much for sure. But
Right.
as we know, a year and a day or so later, and that company was worthless to the world for a while.
Sure.
So I did well. As someone who borrowed money on my parents' line of credit to start a business, it worked out well.
Sure. So, do you have any kind of funny internet stories from the '90s? You always hear about those, or you're not allowed to mention
I
any?
have a ton of. I could fill up the rest of our time with ridiculous internet stories from the '90s.
Do you have
It
a?
was such a stupid time. It was absolutely insane, right? Funny story. You know what? The best one is the one that I told actually at that Future Web Apps on stage, and I
Sure.
told you about. I could tell that one because
All right.
it's a good one. So I'd sold this company, and I was working for Trader, and we're now at I guess it would be January, like early January 2000. So before everything's like exploded. And there was a convention for construction equipment dealers in Chicago, and overnight these venture funded competitors popped up, like literally overnight. It was in December. There were no competitors that were venture funded that had heard of it all. And then January comes and these guys show up at this conference and they've bought most of the space of the convention floor, and they're like high roll and kind of, so one of the two companies that were the sort of main ones that were in that space arranged like a secret meeting with me late at night. Like, come back. Yeah.
This is awesome.
Like is secret meeting late at night. And so I'm meeting with this one guy's like English but lives in San Francisco, and the other two are like Harvard MBAs. They're his like Harvard MBA wingmen. And like the English guy is the classic, Dave McClure hustler guy, but he's a high end hustler. Like he's good. And they want me to come and work for them. That's what the meeting is all about. And they don't want to buy the business. They actually just want me to come and work for them. They just want to poach me as I don't know, just to employ me,
Right.
as a product manager, basically. And it was just such a random. I did not see this coming at all. Like, well, I don't know exactly what they wanted to meet for, and so they lay out an offer for me of a salary, like a really good salary, almost double what I was making, and they would fly me down to San Francisco every 3 weeks for a week, and then I'd just come back, and then they also had this huge signing bonus though of options in this business.
Right.
And so they're explaining to me, I went to business school, so I knew what options were and how it worked. But they're saying, these options, they could be worth like $10-20 million. And this was my best poker face ever. I was like, well, that's nice, but $2 million cash would be better. Totally like, yeah, no, I wouldn't, not interested in that cash. And so the crazy part was they came back to me and like, yeah, okay, yeah, we could do that. And inside, I'm like cool as a cucumber in this negotiation.
Sure.
But the crazy part was I knew that they actually had the money because they've been like throwing around so much money in different things. But they were, as you can imagine, making offers like this. It was one of those ridiculous internet companies. Like it was the pets.com of the construction equipment industry.
Sure.
So they were just throwing away money. They had no business model that would ever work. It was just completely stupid. And so I had this sort of conundrum after that. I'm like, that's a lot of money, $2 million cash. I could just, I had a non-compete, but I thought I could figure out a way out of that. I could buy it out or negotiate out of it, whatever. Like I could make that go away. But what I really struggled with, though, is I'd built a business, I'd built the relationships in the industry, and if I just turn my back on all of that now to go and work for these super flaky guys, am I going to be painted with the super flaky brush the rest of my life? Because I was like 27 years old, right? I'm like, 27, 28 years old. And I thought, I've got a long career ahead of me. I've got an offer like this once, I'll probably get it again. If I play if I don't flake out now, I have a good career ahead of me. That's what I felt like. That my own sort of moral compass was saying, don't do it. And so I didn't do it. But so that's the story I told in Vegas. But what I loved actually was I told you that story like at breakfast that day.
Yeah. I remember that.
And your line was, "What if it was 50?"
I don't remember saying that, but I probably said something smart.
It was so good. Oh, it was the perfect question. Like, yeah, you got me. If it was 50, that's a very different struggle.
Well, to be fair, $50 million, you'd never have to work in pretty much any industry again, and you could pretty much do whatever you want. So it doesn't really matter, right?
So all of my like high-mindedness there kind of, it's tough. Like so I give people a hard time. Well, I mean, I talked about Mark Cuban earlier. I mean, Mark Cuban would have been in that boat, really. Like he sold something. I have never heard him talk about the story. I don't really know much about him, but he sold a video streaming thing for $1 billion that was shelved like 3 months later, right? Like, or whatever the story was. It was just like almost immediately afterwards. And I mean, it's kind of ridiculous on the one hand, but can you blame him, right? Like, it's not his fault that somebody offered way too much for this thing. Yeah, he sold it, sure.
No, fair. But if somebody offered me billions of dollars for anything I'm doing, I'm going to sign over that.
You're
right?
Out.
And I think majority of people are in the same boat. So it's like, love him or hate him, it doesn't really matter, because anybody that makes fun of him would do the exact same thing.
Yeah. But I mean, my situation was a little bit different because it was kind of weird because they were just hiring me away, and I had that whole feeling of like going to compete with the thing that I'd created was a weird dynamic.
Well, and a couple $1 million is a lot different, right? Like, you could.
It bought a lot.
It does
back then, though.
And you could probably span it out the rest of your life if you didn't, buy a yacht or something. But it's not like, it could be retirement money, but it's not guaranteed to ride the rest of your life out, right? You basically need to still work at some point. So I get why you did it, and I've turned down things in the past too, just because it just didn't feel right or a gut reason, and it wasn't even about the money. It's just like, if something feels wrong and you're just like, I'm not gonna like this, or it doesn't feel right, and you turn it down, it totally makes sense. I get that.
Yeah.
So
thanks.
Maybe let's talk about kind of what MailOut is and why you started it, because I'm assuming you started MailOut right after Trader, right? Bought GSNet?
Yeah, well, there was about 5 months actually in between where I was kind of deciding what to do next.
Okay.
So the bubble had burst, and it was time to make things reasonable again. And in that process, I decided, like, okay, let's take the most expensive person off of this salary chart. So I laid myself off, which was fun. And then, so I was thinking through things to do, what to do with my life, basically.
Sure.
And one of the things that came up, or one of the things that we did with GSNet, was to create an email newsletter. And it was incredibly effective. Like, it worked really, really, really well for driving traffic and helping generate sales on there.
Well, it still does, to be fair.
It still does. Oh, yeah. It's still, like, phenomenal. And so I knew that this email newsletter thing was really great, but it was also a gigantic pain in the ass to set up.
Sure.
So, this is back in the .com bubble when everything was either free or $100,000. Those were the two price points of everything.
Right.
So the $100,000 thing was way too much money. We spent, we just had developers at the time, we could pay like $30,000. And so we developed our own email newsletter for a lot less than that. But it was still a big pain in the ass to do. And there were elements of it that were really surprising, like all the bounce management, all the list management stuff. So from that experience, I knew, okay, this creates a lot of value, but the average business is nowhere close to being able to set this up themselves. There aren't really tools out there at the time. that were available. But my thought was, tools will come pretty soon for this. And this is kind of, what we call SaaS software as a service. I think we called them application service providers back then or whatever. But they didn't really exist so much. But I kind of thought, well, the generalist one, like the tools that will be the software for everybody, that'll be a really competitive space. But I wanted to go sort of more in the vertical markets and work with people that I knew in vertical markets to tailor this service to those industries. And so that was the initial vision of MailOut. So we created industry MailOut. We created advisor MailOut. We created Groupie Corral for starving musicians, which was fun. That was basically a charity, but it was good. I got some fun stories out of that too, like just getting to hang out with musicians and do fun things, like go to musician hockey tournaments and play hockey, which is awesome. But that was the vision of it. And now we're just MailOut. Now we're MailOut.com.
Yeah, you guys rebranded recently.
Yeah, we did a rebrand because I actually never did get MailOut.com initially. I slept on it for some stupid reason.
Right.
Instead of just registering the domain when it was available, and the next morning it was gone. So
that's
14
awful.
years. Yeah, 14 years later, I finally got the domain.
Nice. So who did Steven do the rebrand, or who did the design of that?
We worked with Plum Heavy to do the identity.
Okay.
So it's a company in Edmonton, the marketing agency that did great work. They used to just be down the hall from us way back when, like 10 years ago.
Right.
And they've since sort of branched out. But they did a great job of that. And we worked with a company called Fuse in Vancouver to build the site.
Right.
No,
that's awesome.
We wanted to focus our internal resources just on what we're doing. Because actually bigger than the rebrand was the launch of our tools to be able to create mail outs, like to create these emails to be sent out.
Right.
So we did a lot of work on that, and it's top notch. So we've got a system that for creating emails and email newsletter templates even, that is best in class. So we're excited about that.
Sure. No, that's awesome. And I think what's interesting about MailOut is you guys you're not really going after like the mass market. You guys have targeted niche markets that you're going after. And I think that's what's interesting about that. Do you maybe want to talk about kind of how you found those niche markets and, how you're competing with the huge guys that just kind of go for everybody under the sun?
Well, yeah, like for MailOut, we weren't a venture funded thing off the bat. Like we're a bootstrap business, and so and we started it in 2001 when everything on the internet sucked, right? So
right.
So it was harder slugging back then. But we built what I like to call like a real business. So we had to make money.
Sure.
And part of that was sort of following. You kind of follow who signs up. Like the part of what I liked about MailOut was the fact that everybody who used the product kind of promotes it in a way, because people receiving it would say, "Oh, this is cool. How did they do that?" And they, one way or another, or look at the name at the bottom or follow the links or whatever, that they just look at the URLs and things to figure out, oh, it's from this MailOut company. And then they sign up themselves. And that speculation I had before I started it turned out to be true. That's basically how we've gotten all our customers. Between that and people changing jobs, that's how we've done it. We're actually terrible at marketing other than that, which is funny. But anyway, so that was part of how it grew. Yeah. But also just the way that we are. So there's myself and John and Mike are my two partners on this. And like we don't like spam, basically. We're really we hate spam as much as anybody else, or maybe even more so actually. And so when we would choose customers, or when customers would come, we've said no to as many customers or more over the years as we have yes, because we have a real sensitivity to sending spam. And so we kind of, part of that is basically the cost of the customer ongoing.
Sure.
That when somebody's sending when somebody sends spam, it costs us. Like we have to deal with this wake of blacklists and all these like miserable things. So our customers that we tended to like over time have been communicators as opposed to marketers.
Sure.
So we end up dealing with a lot of universities and governments and banks and things where they're sending emails to a list of people who want to or have to receive them.
Sure.
So they're not trying to sell something typically. It's more, although we do have people that sell things. But our real, like where we do really well is these typically big organizations with lots of small lists, lots of sort of disparate accounts, and it's communications people that are sending the emails as opposed to marketers, which is a subtle difference, but it really, in terms of the longevity of a customer, our churn rates are incredibly low, and the cost of our customers afterwards is zero, basically. Like, no cost of goods sold, basically.
Sure.
Which is nice.
No, that's awesome. I think that's what's interesting to me is like you basically have a market and it's doing really well and you're actually making money. And I think that's what a lot of startups kind of forget about is they need to make money at some point. And you've been making money at MailOut for well over a decade.
Yeah. It's it's very different when you have to make money, right? Like we didn't really have a choice. So we didn't have this, there's a whole other set of problems if you're on that treadmill or in that path of, you raise your angel round and you raise your seed round and you're, on and, get into the VC world and you do each different round of funding and so on. And in those cases, they're trying to show growth and eventually figure out how to make some money off of it. But as we know, things don't always work out as you plan in the future. Especially when you're talking about when growth sort of levels off, can you actually make money with this thing? That's pretty tough.
Sure. So do you have? Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
No. Well, I think a lot of businesses, a lot of young startups, it's in a really competitive space right now. We're in a different kind of bubble than the .com bubble of the late 90s, 2000. But it's still a bubble, I think. But I've been talking about the demise of this bubble, like when it's going to burst for like 3 years now. That it felt like it's been imminent, and I've been dead wrong. But I think it is going to burst eventually here, and people are going to have to come back to building businesses that do eventually make money.
Sure. So do you have any advice on how to kind of build a business that kind of from the beginning that can be profitable or start making some money?
Well, I love subscription model businesses because of the predictability to the future. So I love that. So like MailOut and Inked, which I haven't talked about Inked yet.
Sure, we'll get to that in a second.
Subscription model. They're both subscription model businesses. So every month the customers, people who are paying a certain amount of money, and it creates a predictability to being able to plan, which is wonderful. The downside of that, and actually the first business I did too, the classified advertising one was the same deal. The downside though is it's super lean for a long time. So you have to be willing to eat a lot of craft dinner and ramen and whatever else to get through until you can afford some ketchup for your craft dinner and move on. But eventually that flywheel effect of having added more and more of these subscriptions to your revenue base, eventually it starts to have its own momentum, and that part is wonderful. So you have to be willing to basically pay money to go to work for quite a while. Sure. Early on. So when I say that it's got to make money right away, it's not like a consulting business type of thing where you got to be making billable hours right away. That's not necessarily a great way to start things, but you have to be willing to be very lean for quite a while, or willing and able to be lean for a while to create something like that's going to work out. So you have to be patient.
Sure.
And you have to make hard choices as you go along, because there are lots of things where customers will come along and be like, wow, your product's almost perfect for us, but we need these things.
Right.
It'll be like the big deal is, they'll be double your revenue if you take them on as a customer. This particularly early on, this will happen, right? So like big customer comes along, but you would have to sink in a whole bunch of time doing customization for just that client. Right. That's always it's the worst. And so that's the situation where sometimes, but frankly, the wrong thing to do is to take that deal in terms of the long term. But if it means that you can survive another month, sometimes you just have to do it. So it's an art, really, of making these decisions.
Sure.
To say, I don't really want to do this. This isn't a smart thing to do in terms of the long run. But I can see we have to make this decision at this point in time. We have to take this business or go under.
Yeah, so, fair enough.
In that kind of scenario, you do it. But in every other scenario where it's not going to take you down, like if you don't absolutely have to take that money, don't do it. You have to stay the course of building your product that is something that is scalable, that a lot of people can use, so that you can be efficient in your development and particularly like the weight of what you've developed that you have to support later on. Sure. That's the kicker of those really customized things or features for just one customer.
No, that makes a lot of sense. Yeah. And that's actually really good advice. And I think it's so easy to say like, I have this big customer and we need to just pump this out as quick as possible. And if you quite don't make it or, you have to support it. And I think people forget about the maintenance and support of things long-term.
The support is, it has so much to do with the lifetime value of your customers and so on, right? Like if you're supporting lots of little things for every customer that are specific to those customers, that you can't scale, you can't, it costs a lot to keep them. Sure. So the amount of money that you make off of them is really severely diminished. And it affects your ability then, if you're supporting these things, typically the same people who are supporting them or updating them as you go along are the people who would be otherwise developing new stuff. And so you're taking people off of new development just to keep the bowl of spaghetti together, right?
Sure. No, I think that's really good advice. So maybe let's cover kind of what is Inked.it and why you started it.
Sure. So Inked.it is very simply, it's electronic signatures, and typically on things you'd think of as forms. They're usually contracts, but they're more for things you think of as forms. So like waiver forms and for model releases and things like that is how people tend to use it. But it's a tool, it's a platform for being able to create documents to be signed electronically. And what's different about Inked.it is, a couple of things. One is that we didn't want to just make 8.5 by 11 sheets of paper, because the whole idea is, we're not printing these things anymore. So let's not be bound by the restrictions of a piece of paper.
Sure.
Like trying to represent a piece of paper, especially on like a mobile phone.
It's PDF is terrible on a phone.
It's terrible. And there's no way around it, because the nature of a PDF is to reproduce an 8.5 by 11 piece of paper. So you, by its nature, cannot make it mobile responsive.
Right.
You can't do that, or you're breaking what it's supposed to do. And so instead of trying to do that, we said, let's make HTML5 documents that you can sign and open this up to like a whole other world of stuff. So in terms of our roadmap, that it opens up so much more. So that's really cool. But what is really interesting about Inked.it to me is for lack of a better word, social graph that it creates. So instead of just thinking about a document that is signed as a snapshot in time, just optimizing the signing of this thing, what Inked.it does is it uses those documents that we sign as a point between two parties, like this sort of path between two parties, where the parties to that agreement have property, and they have, like when you sign something, you use a real identity. You have to use your real identity, otherwise it's worthless. And so we capture all that kind of information. So we create like the social graph type of thing, but for legal relationships. So whether that's between a company and a person and a person, a company and a company, all of that graph gets modeled within the system that we've created. And what's really powerful is how you can reuse that information. So it's really a lot more convenient to not have to, recreate all, like when I sign stuff for my kids, for example, for school,
right?
I have to write my name, my address, my phone number 4 times for one child's one set of documents, because they'll take a piece of paper and send it a bunch of different places. Yep. And all of the other electronic signature tools, they'll make it so that you can sign those documents the same way and have the same experience, but just do it electronically on your phone, which kind of speeds things up. But it's like a nominal increase in productivity, where we're saying like, okay, well, let's take that and make it so that you're not having to do all this rework for anybody, like whether it's the person signing it or whether it's the person collecting all the data off of it. Let's reduce the rework and make it really convenient. And the path to that builds this social graph, which is really cool and powerful. So
sure.
That's the story of it.
No, I think that's interesting. And what I found interesting about Inkton and the idea is the fact that you're basically modernizing the contract, and you're basically saying, I don't really care what screen size you're on. We're going to optimize the experience for that screen size. So you can sign your kid's waiver form, or, if you're going quickly on some sort of, weekend trip, whether you're going skiing or snowboarding or whatever, you basically can sign quickly on an iPad or a phone just as you're boarding the bus, right? And you don't really have to worry about this kind of weird, clunky zoom in, zoom out, pinch to zoom thing on, your phone.
Yeah, there's no hardware constraints. Like it's you don't have to have a particular device. You don't have to have downloaded an app even. It's a tool that can be used across all the devices that you use to access the internet. You can sign stuff, and that's really powerful and really cool.
Sure. No, I think that's awesome. So maybe we can talk a little bit about what it's kind of like running a company and startups, and I guess Mailus. At what point is it not a startup anymore? Like when you're making money, because Mailus been around 14, 15 years now.
Yeah, well, 2001 is when we started working on it. It's 2015, so 14 years.
Yeah, so that's a long time. Is it still a startup? Like at what point do you go from a startup to a full-fledged business?
I don't know. I feel like it's when you start to when you're making a salary and making money.
Sure.
Then it's definitely not a startup anymore. Like if you can post a dividend, if you can actually dividend out something and you're making a salary, things are definitely not in the startup phase anymore. But because a startup is more, I don't know. I think the word startup should apply. It should have some other connotations other than just being a new business as well. Like I think startups mean a business that can scale as well.
Okay, interesting.
So that's kind of like one of the connotations of the word that I think is useful to help distinguish stuff. Because, I mean, if you're starting an insurance brokerage, it's a good business. There's nothing wrong with it, but I don't think I would use that descriptor of it. I wouldn't categorize it as a startup.
Sure.
So.
No, that's fair.
And so those early stages, there are some different sort of stages of when you're starting out, of like, when it starts out just as an idea, and then you start to, figure out, okay, is there anything to this idea? And so you do that kind of customer development stuff, which I'm not really into this, following very precisely, the Steve Blank customer development or Eric Ries lean startup methodologies and so on. Those are good things. They're really good tools generally, but I think people need to use their own brains in these processes too.
Sure.
A lot of them are recipes to never start.
Yeah, I find it's always interesting. People seem to try to always follow other people, and they should just try to figure out their own path, right? Like, no matter who you follow, and I can't remember who said it the best, but basically they're like, look, I'll tell you how I got to where I am, but don't do that, because you're not me, and you'll never get there if you take exactly the steps that I had, because there's no possible way that you could recreate how I got somewhere, because we lead two different lives. We have different backgrounds. We're different experiences. We're probably in different industries, right? And I always found that kind of fascinating to me. It's like all these like startup books, and I'm not saying they're bad. It's just, you like you said, you kind of got to take what you can from those books, but you also need to use your head and figure it out for yourself, right? There is no like check these boxes and you're going to be successful.
Yeah, like every business book, you have to take with a grain of salt. In my view, most business books, you get 80% of the value out of by reading the cover. It's the title of the book. Oh, permission marketing, right? It's like, oh, that's a really great idea. The concept makes a lot of sense. Way to go, Seth Godin. That's really ingenious.
Fair enough.
But yeah, there's even nuances of the businesses that you need to figure out, like that sort of, the lean processes, for example. Like they're amazing for iterating on an idea once you've had it, but it doesn't really help you with the big grand vision in the first place.
Right.
Which, when you're doing something, when you're heading into complete uncharted waters, there's some nuance to that. You can't just be like iterating on one little tiny facet of it necessarily, right? Like maybe you can if your great big idea is, a search engine box,
sure,
right? Which is pretty awesome, right? Pretty great. But small little rapid iterations on the one thing, it doesn't get you to figuring out how to map the planet and have cars driving around by themselves, right? Like that's, you don't just get there by short little iterations.
Fair enough. Yeah, no, Greg, I think that's really good advice. And sadly, we're out of time. So maybe kind of in closing, maybe let's mention where people can find Mailout and Inked It and yourself online.
Sure. So my cell phone, call me direct. So mailout.com for if you have a need to send email newsletters, and inkedit.com for electronic signatures, especially for forms. It's a platform for everything from like HR stuff to sales to whatever you're doing, whenever you've got lots of things to be signed.
Sure.
And for myself, I'm on Twitter and LinkedIn, Gregg, Gregg, Oldring, Oldring, like an old ring on your finger. That finds me. So I'm
Perfect.
Gregg Oldring on Twitter and LinkedIn.
Perfect. And I'll post those in the show notes so people can go there directly.
Great. Yeah, and I'd love to hear from people too. That'd be really fun.
Yeah. Well, thanks, Greg, for doing the show. And this has been really good. And, well, as always, we'll keep in touch because, well, we've kept in touch for a number of years. So
yes. Great. Well, thanks, Kevin. I really appreciate you having me on the show.
Yeah, really no problem. Thanks again for doing this, and we'll talk soon.
Cheers.
Okay, bye.
Thanks for listening. You can visit past shows at buildingthefutureshow.com. If you're going to the Startup Expo on February 16th and 17th in Fort Lauderdale, Florida, and want to record an episode, please contact me. The music for the show is by Electric Mantra. Check them out at electricmantra.com. Until next time, keep building the future.